recorded. Okay, let me just introduce myself. My name is Gek Cheng, and I'm the director of the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute of Malaysia, and I'm also in as a director. I'm also part of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, where I teach film and sometimes write a little bit about politics, but am currently working on the durian. Thank you very much for attending this webinar on a Saturday afternoon. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Bridget Welsh, and Professor Khoo Boo Teik, who will be the discussant. Both, sorry, I'm distracted because there are people coming in and I have to do that as well as do their introduction. Okay, let me just start now. And I'm really pleased to introduce to you the two participants, Dr. Welsh and Dr. Khoo Boo Teik, who are both renowned political scientists working on Malaysia. Bridget, Dr. Welsh, I'm sure most of you would have heard or read her work. She writes a lot on Malaysian politics, and you would have read her column in Malaysia Kini. Bridget is an independent scholar who's based in Kuala Lumpur, and she specializes in Southeast Asian politics with a focus on Malaysia, but also Myanmar, Singapore, and Indonesia. And she is currently an honorary research associate with us, with the Asia Research Institute of University of Nottingham. And she's been with us for 2 years. She's very prolific. She has also not just written lots of books, reports, and articles, but has also edited quite a few of these books. And her latest book is on Sabah. It's called Sabah from the Ground, 2020 Elections and Politics of Survival. And it just came out in May, and you can get copies at Gerak Budaya bookstore. Before she came back to Kuala Lumpur, she was teaching at John Cabot University in Italy, EPAC University in Turkey, Singapore Management University, SAIS, JHU, and Hofstra University. She is a senior advisor for Freedom House. She's also a member of the International Research Council of the National Endowment for Democracy and a core member of the Asian Barometer survey covering 15 countries in East Asia. So, she's got an extensive portfolio and really knows the region very well, Southeast Asia, but also East Asia. I think without further ado, so I also I'm going to move on and just mention that our discussant is Professor Khoo Boo Teik, who is Professor Emeritus at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies and a research fellow emeritus at the Institute of Developing Economies in Japan. This year, well, from April until September this year, he is visiting senior fellow at ISIS in Singapore. And they published his book recently, last year, called Malay Politics, Parlous Condition, Persistent Problems, and the Making of Anwar Ibrahim's Humane Economy. So that's another book to look out for. Okay, so today's seminar by Dr. Welsh will be on the impact of COVID-19 on democracy in Malaysia. We've seen how COVID-19 seems to undermine democracy in Malaysia with the declaration of emergency rule and, suspension of parliament until only recently. But Dr. Welsh argues that there are also opposite trends. And I think this is an intriguing point. And in such bleak times, as we keep hearing about COVID deaths, rising number of positive cases, and the rakyat at breaking point, it certainly makes for a hopeful future, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more. So Bridget will take just a little bit about procedure. Bridget will take about 45 minutes to present her talk, and then I'll invite Professor Boo Teik to say a few words on the subject and on Bridget's presentation, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. And this lecture is recorded and will be uploaded to the YouTube channel. So if you're interested to get the link, just email me or leave a message in the chat box after this. If you don't want to be recorded, you can keep your video off. I suggest that you please mute your mics to prevent feedback, and also maybe turn off your video so that you don't become a featured speaker, and to prevent disruption during the presentations. You can unmute your mic to ask questions or type them in the chat box when we're done. So without further ado, please help me to welcome Bridget Welsh. Unmute.
Bridget. Yes, that's right. The welcome greeting on all of these things. Unmute, you're on mute. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's really a pleasure to be here with so many Khoos. We have not only Gek and Boo Teik, but also Andrew and others. So and of course non-Khoos as well. And I'm hoping that this conversation that we're having will be able to stimulate additional discussion. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks relatively brief, and I'm going to open up now here and share my slides. So just give me a second to do this as we are, here we are. So I'm hoping that this will be shared. Is this not yet? Nope, hold on. Is my screen? Huh? Not yet. Huh?
There we go. That's the one.
Is it? Got it. Okay. All right. So one of the things I want to suggest is that, in the context of a transforming country, we see a situation where that the focus has been on, how the political elites don't necessarily actually have managed COVID-19, or how they've actually used more authoritarian measures. In this presentation and these ideas, I want to talk about how the society is changing as a product of being in what I would argue the most serious crisis the country has ever faced. And in some ways, I'd like to be even more provocative and suggest that, one of the things that's happened ironically out of COVID-19 is that the same forces that helped to galvanize the political change that happened in 2018 are still very much alive, but in some ways transforming. And in fact, what we see is a situation where COVID-19 in Malaysia, in some ways, is actually triggering a different type of Malaysia. The question, of course, that comes out of that is whether or not this is a Malaysia that is better for Malaysia or not, which I hope we will continue to discuss as I develop my argument. So what I've decided to do is to present essentially sort of four major points, and I'm keeping them very around different sets of rubrics. I want to talk first about what I see of the multidimensional aspects of COVID-19 crisis. And this is not to extend some of the conversations that have happened broadly in public intellectual discourse in Malaysia, but more to kind of understand that the crisis is so serious and its multiple dimensions that it helps us understand the responses, which is the bulk of the conversation today. And I want to talk about how I see the emergence of new norms and new points of conflict coming out of narratives on social media space, but also in terms of new survey results, as well as in terms of conversations that we can see that are beyond narratives in terms of action. So we look first at norms, then at mobilization, and of course some of the impact of some of the issues that are happening within the political parties and among the elites, which in itself are also contributing to the dynamic, this kind of a reckoning of crisis that is happening in the current context of Malaysia.
Bridget, your slides have disappeared.
Oh, mine, see up here. I don't know why. Huh?
We just have your picture in the chat box.
Let me see again. I'll try again. I was looking at my slides. Yeah, here we go again. Here, do you see this?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Well, you didn't miss much in the first slide anyway. All right, so is this everybody good?
Yep.
Okay, so the three different dimensions of the crisis. Obviously we can begin with the fact that it is very much a health crisis. We saw a record number of cases yesterday. Within the next few weeks, we're going to see 1 million cases in terms of recorded cases. And I think probably by the end of next month, based on trajectories, we're going to see over 10,000 deaths. These deaths, these cases, both and the numbers in terms of the deaths do not account for the total number of people being affected by COVID-19. COVID-19 deaths, for example, only record those that are actually positive, but not necessarily, for example, maybe impacted by a lack of access to healthcare because of COVID, or may have died after having COVID. These cases are amidst a positivity rate that is very, very serious. We, all of us know, especially those of us in the Klang Valley, how serious the health system is being affected. For the last few days, I can only share a personal story in that I had to work very hard to find access to a hospital for a friend of mine who was in Category 4. That person spent an entire evening without food and water in an emergency room waiting for those things to be able to be provided. There is a shortage of beds, ICUs, and of course increasingly shortages of oxygen in large parts of the Klang Valley. And this is a very important issue, not only in terms of its seriousness, but to recognize that Klang Valley is the most equipped place in Malaysia to manage a health crisis, given the facilities that it has. And the concern, of course, among many of the health professionals is what the crisis will do in terms of impacting and when it moves outside of the Klang Valley, as is expected because of the movement during Hari Raya Haji and so forth. This is a far-reaching health crisis, and why I mention this is because I think we're very far from over. There is a silo strategy dependent on vaccinations and very impressive rate of vaccinations in the last 2 months, but there is still tremendous vaccine inequity among different populations, especially not only including undocumented persons, but also access within Malaysia. And in particular, I'd like to highlight the impact on Sabah, where there continues to be very serious problems of issues of registration and access. And there is, of course, much deeper concerns of that the crisis that is in the Klang Valley extends out. But what this means from a perspective of the health crisis politically is that it is actually really changing the view about government as being able to solve the problems. And this is a very fundamental shift in the norms of the way Malaysians think about about politics. And of course, at the same time, it's feeding a lot of the frustration and despair. And for all of us who know, I think, and at this point it may be all of us, but for most of us who know people who are experiencing this firsthand, it is a very deeply traumatic event for families that are experiencing COVID in different forms and ways. At the same time, not moving, is it? I'm trying to move my slides and they're not moving. We're seeing an economic crisis of different dimensions. We see contracting growth, which depending on the numbers, we do not know how much the contraction is going to be this year. And keep in mind, the growth numbers don't necessarily capture the breadth of that growth, but we're looking at 1/3 of contraction, 1/5 of contraction of the GDP last year in terms of an MCO. The MCOs here in lockdowns are likely to continue at least for the next month or so in the Klang Valley. And this, of course, has had profound impact because these are happening in where the concentration of the economic GDP is located, and of course, it is having spillover effects in terms of job loss. We see tremendous restructuring of sectors. This in itself could be a tremendous. This topic in the slide can be a seminar in itself. We're seeing changing in the aspects of manufacturing, changing in the impact of food and beverages. We're seeing considerable losses in businesses. The numbers continue to grow. We saw data that comes out with workers and wages have dropped for the first time in over a decade. We see repeated concerns being raised by the international community that Malaysia is being left out of the international supply chains, which will have long-term implications of being able to get back into those supply chains when things do open up. We're seeing the costs of corruption, be it from the issues associated with syringes and not being pushed, to the issues of the leakages in the system in terms of the issues of contracts, much of which of that has been not fundamentally being discussed because there's a gap on those discussions in Parliament. And we're seeing, transformation of the role of the private sector, and of course, many foreign workers are being pushed out, treated extremely poorly, and at the same time, the dependence on them has become very clear. And so this is a very important, these forces of kind of reform in the economy, be it from wage growth to restructuring, to fundamental institutional reform, are coming through in this crisis. And why I put this out here is that it is a source of conflict, which in turn will not only weaken the revenue base coming in to resolve crisis, which has been the traditional tool for the government to address issues, but it also opens up different forms of conflict that I think we will see in politics in Malaysia as we move forward. Let's see if this is actually working the third time. It's a bit slow, these movements. Very bizarre. Wait, nope, no, it's gone up. Yes, the effects on society. And this is where I want to highlight, these are all things that have been in the press, so I'm not going to belabor them because these set the context. And one is that, we see clearly the inadequate social safety net. Here is people lining up outside relatively close to where I live in Ampang, for Zoraida's center. We see weaknesses in terms of widening inequalities that have gotten significantly worse. Most of the focus of this is on issues of class, but we also see a situation where, I see some new people. Hi.
Hi, can you please turn off your...
issues of regional differences in terms of the impact within the context of the heartland, as well as the issues associated with the kind of rural and urban divide, as well as Borneo. Issues, of course, of gender dynamics, issues associated with ethnic differences. These are, crises traditionally. Not only do they widen existing inequalities, but they also reinforce and create new ones. And these are things that are clearly emerging. What we see, and as we're looking at how COVID is evolving. We see deepening of xenophobia on the part of the state apparatus. And in this context, we see a situation where there is an attempt to return to a pattern of racialized politics, but to find a different target of that, and of which the foreign workers have been the recipients of that. We see a situation of very profound generational effects on both the old and the young, especially old, because they've been most hard hit in terms of comorbidities and others in their quality of their lives, and young people, of course, because they've also had the brunt of the economic impacts in terms of unemployment and of course educational opportunities. And what this means is that this crisis, arguably, I believe, is the most serious crisis the country has ever faced. And this is a positive thing in that Malaysia has not had the same level of crises as it has in the past, but at the same juncture, it also means that it is very much a political reckoning, a political trauma that I think will have profound effects, and this is where this question of this presentation is to look at what these effects are going to be, how we're seeing these trust networks, these inequalities, what sort of political narratives and mobilization do we see emerging from this. And so I want to start, I have 9 slides here, and I want to start with the focus on kind of what I see as in the issues of changing norms. And the first thing that I think is very apparent, and I put a kind of a satire discussion here as a slide, is that we see the way that people are talking about their leaders. And of course, we know in Malaysian politics, there's also often been the demonization of the other leader. And of course, the impact of the Najib Tun Razak tenure, of course, was a lot of antipathy expressed towards him and his wife and others. But what we are seeing now is a much broader kind of antipathy towards politicians across the political spectrum. And of course, what's important is that now, in contrast to the past, that the public is very much controlling the political narratives, as opposed to political, placement of discussions or political leaders, or even using cyber troopers and others to try to plant stories. Those things have less impact than the narratives of the public itself. Now, of course, we can recognize that this is disproportionately in the urban areas, but I would argue that because of social media and because of the nature of COVID itself, where people are in their bedrooms, in their hotel rooms, but more in the context of being in their living rooms, they are in a situation where they access social media in a different way and in greater intensity than they might have had in the past. At the same time, what we are seeing is that the emergence of new types of leaders in society. And we've always had, for example, the very important role of religious leaders and televangelists among Muslim community, for example. Many of those leaders are now part of the political spectrum, such as, for example, Tuan Ibrahim and PAS now. But we also see now new leaders like Ibi Liu, the role of professionals, more social activists that are being given a lot more influence. And of course, they coincide with the role of celebrities and influencers, but many of the celebrities themselves, like Harith Iskander, for example, are taking on important political discussions, leading sets of discussions. So instead of having articles be press statements of different political parties or what such and such person said, Anwar, or that person, we're seeing very much a very different types of sets of narratives and pluralism in the context of what is happening on the ground. There, of course, is also a very important dimension to that, is that this also provides less support, less ability for the kind of hierarchical politics of the past. So when things become very conflictual, there's less ability to manage some of that. But it is a very different types of norms as some of the feudal dimensions of leadership are shifting. With that, we also see a dynamic where what is a good government or what is the right government is actually changing. We see we have an idea of, instead of leadership being just about representing my community or the community you're from, much more focused on the results of government and the issues of competency. So the conceptualizations and the predominant conceptualizations of legitimacy are shifting. And we also see a situation where, that many communities and many individuals are now recognizing that the discussion of that the community is being taken care of, particularly, for example, in the Malay community, is actually creating a situation where many have been forced to take care of themselves. And this, of course, again, contributes to the notion of what the government is doing, how it operates, and whether or not it's serving the different constituencies and different citizens in particular sets of ways. And for many people from the perspective of being in the urban area, many of these aspects of political awakening have happened much earlier, decades ago, 2008, 2018, other factors. But we really do see kind of the central point of how the role that government should play is actually changing. And the way that the government is operating on behalf of the people is also fundamentally shifting and broadening from a perspective into a more negative outlook. But at the same time, with that comes more questioning. And I think we see also, while there's still tremendous selfishness, especially on the part of the political elite and among those among the elites generally, we do also see the emergence of kind of a focus on local community, focus at the things in the neighborhood area, focusing on your social networks, the more immediate, because implicitly the centralization is not functioning. So there has been a decentralization of activity and engagement in very different sets of ways. And in this context, many of the parties, such as PAS, for example, that relies on moral legitimacy for its leadership, this is really facing a tremendous decay. And what will be interesting to watch as this evolves is how the nature of Islamic politics also shifts, because if you do not have the same moral legitimacy in how you're governing, then of course this helps to undermine your political support, especially among, not necessarily among your core supporters, but those that you would be trying to win over. And while I do believe that a lot of what has happened about perceptions of race in terms of activity and causes of the COVID-19 are still very pervasive in society, and I do think that the current leadership, which is very much I call the 1969 leadership and mindset of the NEP, they think about politics racialized, highly racialized. There is still a kind of shifting dimensions about issues of race or religion that are coming, and we can see this in some of the preliminary data among younger people. But of course, there is a sense of more inclusive narrative, not necessarily with regard to foreign workers or undocumented persons, but in the context of being Malaysian in this area. And it's interesting to note that so many series of examples of when political elites start to turn to race and religion, the very strong backlash. And if we compare this to 2 years ago or 3 years ago, when those types of identity politics narratives basically overpowered alternative inclusive narratives, we see a more inclusive narrative coming to the fore compared to the past. This doesn't mean that it's the dominant one, or even it is being able to overshadow all of that, but it is an important feature of what is happening. A third and a very important feature of the normative shift has been about the willingness to speak out. People in government positions, people who are professionals, even if some of those things still remain anonymous, such as some of the reports from doctors, they are speaking out, and they're raising concerns in the public arena. And implicitly, what we're seeing, this is contributing to what I was mentioning earlier, alternative voices of leadership, alternative ways of thinking and listening about what politics is, and what are the different ways of thinking about policies. In particular, I highlight the kind of increasing pluralism among the Malay community and the prominence of a whole series of Malay professionals. And of course, we see responses that are happening in Borneo, in Sabah and Sarawak, where there's, for example, even though the weaknesses of the GRS leadership are pretty clear, what we see is that there is this common Sabah narrative that is actually taking ground, while similarly so the Sarawak nationalist narrative is also quite profound, and they are speaking out about those differences in public and raising those concerns. And it's not just the political elites that are doing that, which used to be that it was kind of a political play and bargaining position. Now we see much more robustness in those narratives being expressed. And I think with implicit in this is that there is, that people are talking about the cost of lack of reform, but even the cost of the lack of competency, which I think is probably, and what we see is that citizens are feeling empowered. They have a sense of ownership over what is happening, because it's of course affecting their lives, and they're angry when things are being affected in a negative way. So this brings me to 3 different points that I want to raise about mobilization and how I see kind of really important shifts. The first of which has been kind of one that is, I think, really showcased Malaysia internationally, which has been the solidarity and support initiative. And this, I want to highlight, has been citizen-driven, and it is expanded and continued and been consistent throughout COVID-19. So the emergence of Kita Jaga Kita, to of course the White Flag movement most recently, are examples of this kind of solidarity movements, and it's important to appreciate that these are very they've not only taken on regional dimensions, but they're quite pervasive across different ethnic lines, across different class lines. And what we see is that, it is reinforcing a conversation about based on need. There is this idea of being Malaysian, not just one person versus others. Need is need, and people reach out across that. And even among some undocumented. There has been some of those issues a little bit more challenging especially in places like Sabah, but it has not only, we do see this kind of humanism that is there. In a sense, this is, I think this had important social implications. While the stigma of being poor is still very significant, there has been some reduction of that. And there's been this kind of sense of shared fortifying trauma that I was speaking about earlier. And I think this particular issue about solidarity and support, I think has a very interesting implications, right? What we see in all the major political parties, such as UMNO or DAP or even PAS, and we see a situation where there are the kind of these right and left ideological divisions over issues of wages, over issues of spending, and they've been accommodated because they have not necessarily, that these ideological divisions have not spilled over because to the same degree, because other divisions of race and religion and party loyalty help to keep some of those differences together. But we do see quite significant differences of ideology happening in within the narratives of policy discussions within political parties and within the state as a whole. And more fundamentally, Malaysia is a country that has had a considerable suppression of the left. And because of this race-based politics have overshadowed class-based politics, we see the emergence, I think, a strengthening of the left and class-based politics in Malaysia. And what is interesting to see is how this is already starting to have snippets of conversation. And I use the word snippets carefully because it is still very limited, but about the issues of new wages, new worker rights, new concepts of what is required for healthcare, and new concepts about being rights more generally within the area of issues of civil liberties and others. And if we think about the crisis that comes as close to having another crisis, which it was definitely its crisis in its own right of 1969, there was a rewriting of the political formula and rights after this crisis. And I think we're having similar issues now that are starting to come out in the conversations about need for spending or other things along those lines. The second big kind of mobilization transformation that I see happening is the emergence of young people as setting the narrative. And it is very pervasive across the region. We see the hunger salute and issues in Myanmar and others and Thailand, and we see protests of students in Indonesia. Well, I think that Malaysia should not be left out of this equation in terms of the youth activism that has begun to take root. And in this context, for those of us who study Malaysian politics, when we look, for example, at the survey data, we do really see quite important cohort effects. So, for example, the Reformasi generation, people who came into political life in the 99 and 88, 99, they have very different views about Reformasi and reform than earlier generations and even some after. And so we can see these people in their 50s now and how they vote politically. They're still very much shaped by the Reformasi period. And as a consequence, we're going to see a COVID-19 generation that is going to be profoundly impacted by this. The question becomes how that activism, of course, is channeled. But I want to emphasize the importance of voting, job security, social justice are kind of key themes. Education, I should have put on the list, and quality education. And what's interesting about these youth engagement is that they don't follow the path of the past, where that they're kind of happening outside of political parties, completely outside of the political parties, and there has not been this kind of, like, even the Bersih movement, even though it evolved into something that was completely outside of, more distant from political parties, its original genesis was tied to some of political parties. These events are not. These movements are, and so there are some already new cohort of leaders that are coming in, and I give these examples. A third kind of collected issue besides the youth engagement in politics is the new protest movements. So today, the convoy Lawan is happening around the time of this talk. We see someone already wanting to interrupt my talk, which is fine, and that's happy. Somebody's got their mute on, and it's good to speak over me.
That is its natural steam because.
And then we have a situation where we have in the protest movements, we have examples. I put Indy 18, which is but other forms such as the Black democracy protests that happened in Johor, the Black Flag movement, the Lawan movement, and we can see, especially on social media, but not only on social media, because a lot of this is happening still among the social networks and disproportionately young, but not only young in this context. New parties and new movements and political parties. MUDA is one of the parties that has emerged. We see a Garak independent movement that has emerged. I think what is interesting is how this particular protest will evolve. I think what is likely is that, unlike in the past, they began to be co-opted by existing political parties because of the kind of the norms that I was talking about earlier. They may choose we see the pattern of choosing new forms of entities to channel that, and of course this of course may shift when elections come around, where they have to make political alliance relationships in order if they want to field candidates. But because there is no political elections for the next few years, we see a situation where they're taking those choices. But these movements are relying on social media, and so, as I said, they're kind of a reservoir for change that are speaking to and it's really bubbling in that context. But there's leaders, but there's also the focus is not on the leaders, and that is something that is very important in this area in terms of which is quite interesting, and that of course affects a regional pattern of way protest is happening. Now, I just have a couple more slides because I know I'm reaching that time period, but I want to emphasize that and talk a little bit about the issues of elites, because when they talk about politics in Malaysia, they continually want to talk about, who's going to be in power, whether or not they're going to be the numbers, all these sets of issues. And what I've tried to do in most of my presentation is saying to me, from my perspective, the real politics of this country are the things that are happening from below, the profound shifts that are happening in terms of political empowerment. But one has to also recognize that the elites are contributing to that. We have a divided, weak minority government, and I think it's probably less understood about how divided this government is, the factionalism within Bersatu, the challenges of being able to accommodate the different interests. And while people stay for the status quo, I think Muhyiddin Yassin plays an important linchpin in keeping those different forces together. And those divisions, unfortunately, have contributed to the very diverse positions that the government have taken on series of policies. The coalition system, however, as in terms of new coalitions emerging, has not been functioning well. We see tremendous party factionalism in multiple parties, UMNO being one. We have the polarization of the political system, which basically limits, constraints who can actually co-form with others. And of course, we have tremendous leadership failings across the political spectrum of leaders not willing to make way. And because COVID-19 has created a situation where party elections have been put off, this is preventing party renewal, but it's also creating tremendous backlogs inside of the parties in terms of new generation emerging. So it's not a coincidence that new generation are taking to outside of the political system, because within the political system, they're not able to rise. So we have we have some young, talented leaders in many of the different parties that are not giving political space, and the people who think about young leaders are no longer part of the young leaders, in the sense that they're now in their 40s and 50s, which in the context of the demographics of Malaysia is no longer young in terms of political space. We also see this situation where I think that I've said in January 1st of this year, I do not believe elections would be held this year, national elections. If anything, there will be Sarawak elections. Sarawak elections, probably the earliest they might be held is November. Of course, I think we're still on the beginning of the Delta variant, and we still have the Lambda variant that's out there, and we have not reached a plateau in terms of vaccination rates. And when we reach the plateau, then we will see what the impact of those who don't vaccinate will be in terms of keeping the COVID-19 situation for a longer period. But what we see in this political lockdown is that we see parties that are becoming much weaker, not only in terms of national leadership, but political parties that are losing their connectivity to their base. And so what happens is that their core is what people can rely on, and that core has been shrinking for many of the larger parties. And of course, many of the parties had cores through coalition building. And those coalition building is actually very fragmented. So you're in a situation in Malaysia where you're now in post-election coalitions. So therefore, getting and maintaining your political support during an election period is much more challenging, and so that we're likely to see a much more continued, persistent, fragmented political process. And the parties themselves have yet to reform. And this may sound like a negative thing at a certain level, and it is because of the denial that's happening at these parties, but it's also opening up the political process in very different sets of ways. And of course, we are also seeing how the political system is working. So using political tools for survival. So the use of incentives and the cost of that, what we saw in the terrible LRT crash, the costs and issues of using political pressure, and the impact on issues of how this affects corruption, and how corruption charges and corruption issues of governance over corruption. We see a kind of discussion about the elites in terms of one of the most important implications here has been that we see differences, that the government is no longer this one entity, that there are many different dimensions. So the civil service and the conflicts within different policy discussions are actually emerging. And this is actually, while on one hand it is troubling and of course it's affecting the issues of performance, but it is also constructive because it provides different points of engagement and also shows that there is, it's forcing a reckoning on issues of bureaucratic reform, and the need for different actors to separate themselves from the politics. Of course, not all of this is happening, but it is happening in some pockets, which I think people may not necessarily see or even recognize. So let me close the conversation now by turning it over to Boo Teik, and hopefully I think I've given some points to think about. But what I would like to suggest, and what I am trying to suggest, is that when we look at things that are happening from below, there's a tendency now in Malaysia, because of the crisis being so bad, and it is really all of us experience this despair, hearing about our friends, knowing what people are experiencing in terms of the numbers of suicides and issues of the hospital care, and it is hard not to step away from that. But when we look at the kind of the political transformation that is emerging and out of the problems of the system and the crisis that's there, I think that there are important transformations that point to a very different type of Malaysia. And I think that unfortunately the elites will continue to rely on old identity politics and others to try to respond to that. But the narrative of this is not as strong as it was in the past, because new narratives and new experiences have emerged. And this in itself may ironically help to bring about a new Malaysia that is more constructive, but it won't be an easy process. And it will be and continue to be a painful one as Malaysia continues its crisis. And of course, it's still early days yet in the crisis, in my view, which of course is probably not good news from the perspective of people experiencing it. But I still feel that we're going to see more changes coming, and I think that these are going to be very important to watch. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. So can I just get Kai Tay to turn his video or her video off? If you're not presenting. Oh, okay, never mind. Okay, Boo Teik, the floor is yours. Would you like to respond?
Thank you, Gabe, and thank you, Bridget, for that long and comprehensive coverage. I'm not sure I hope you can see me. I mean, I don't usually say things like that, but I'm not very good at these things. And I see my own picture at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. But I assume that you can at least see me, but more importantly, that you can hear me. Well, I think Bridget has given us a lot of things to think about over a very wide range of issues. And really, I shouldn't try to cover everything that she has talked about. And I would just make some comments based on the thoughts that have occurred to me as Bridget was making her presentation. And I hope that in that sense, I would be able to provide some points that would allow us to have a discussion rather than, my trying to give you a rather ordered and systematic analysis of the current situation. Well, of course, the COVID situation is bad, and we all know, the rough dimensions, the scale of the problems, the degree of people's suffering. You might even say the unequal levels of plight that are being shown, throughout the society. But if I may try and talk about some issues in a slightly different way, maybe that would allow us also to take a different look at the politics. The first thing that came to my mind is that it used to be fairly common for many of us working on politics to use illness as a metaphor for talking about the political problems and the political disorders. We would say that there would be disorders of the body politic, for example. And so it probably, this was the first time in which we've had not just illness as metaphor, but we've got a pandemic that coincided with the political crisis that developed at the end of February, of last year. I'm sure, people here know the details very well. There's no need for me to go into, how the Pakatan Harapan government imploded and what's happened. So that, actually we had this problem of seeing the disorders of the political system developing, getting into a worse shape. And for a very long time, personally, I thought that, these were symptoms that political order was coming to an end. That what we had was really a moribund regime that over 20 years, since the advent of reformacy, was slowly progressing. If progressing is the right word, proceeding towards its actual end. And many of us, I'm sure, thought that with the setting up of the Harapan government and with the reform agenda, we would see the construction of a new political order without knowing what its actual dimensions, the actual measures that would be taken, the final results, etc. But suddenly all that was, more or less aborted. And then you might say that, for some reason, the timing was such that the pandemic practically put a seal, a timely seal onto the old order. This would be, my way of thinking about how the politics and the illness have come together, the pandemic have come together. It is, in some ways, a disastrous situation, but it really confirms that a particular order is really finished. The problems that I think Bridget has been talking about today are really the problems of, what will come up in this period or after the pandemic. Okay. Now, Bridget has mentioned many different things and, good and bad, things that are not so bright, let's say, and also things that may be more optimistic. But perhaps she has not mentioned, one important factor. I think the question is, how much worse will this crisis get before it gets better? Some of us used to joke, probably we learned it from some American comedian somewhere. Things always get worse before they get worse still. And we all know that, in fact, usually, historically speaking, a lot of countries, a lot of political systems, economic systems, etc., will only begin to undertake reform when they are hit by very severe crises, right? I mean, this is not to wish crisis on anybody as such, because the real suffering, is very painful for a lot of people. But nonetheless, I would imagine that here today, we need to pay some attention to whether we think this particular crisis, the pandemic, will get much worse, and for how much longer, and with what impact, further impact, before we can really start thinking about what kinds of new solutions are likely to emerge from here, what kinds of reforms of the political system, the economy, and other things are, within our reach or within even conception. For example, if the situation gets even worse, and it has certainly got worse, over the last year, right? People will begin to question not just, the quality of leadership, but they will also start to question the quality of different systems of healthcare, the systems of education, of social welfare, and of many other things. And it is in this kind of situation where I think the severity of the current crisis, will become a major factor. Let us imagine, it may or may not happen soon. People are saying that if you can get, vaccination up to a certain rate, and you can get, the so-called herd immunity, and if the infection rate goes down, the mortality rates go down, the number of cases all go down, pretty soon some people will feel as if they've had a bad time, but it was a bad dream rather than a living nightmare that persists on and on. But if this situation gets worse for, quite a bit longer, let's say another 1.5 years, 2 years, right? Things are going to get so bad that perhaps what Bridget refers to as the narratives of the future, I think might take on a very different kind of complexion from, if people feel that, we've suffered, but our suffering is now over. So I believe that that is an issue that we haven't yet really seen people or heard people discussing much, right? In this regard, there have been some murmurs of how, we should really have a moratorium on politicking, or moratorium on political debate, and so on. And really what is needed, when it has been proposed in different kinds of guises, it would be, almost like an interim government that is non-partisan, that is like all party, or you could have an interim government that would have a much higher degree of, let's say, technocratic representation, of professional participation, rather than, political participation. I believe that this is another one of those things that can supply a sort of narrative in times of crisis, in times of many crises. Some crises, of course, were fabricated crises, like say, after a coup d'etat. Very often people will say, no, we don't want politics for a while. We don't trust the politicians. So let us have the technocrats. And then, of course, you can have technocrats who are extremely political technocrats, right? I don't need to get into details for ourselves here. But it is tied up with the question of public perceptions of the quality of leadership, quality of competence, as Bridget said. But I think leading from there, it will open up other questions. People are beginning to, you see a lot of stories, over WhatsApp, social media. You get a lot of jokes, a lot of people mocking at the things that don't work out properly, either in one center or in another center. Although there is, I must say, a lot of empathy for the people who are the frontliners, for the people who are there, trying to organize and manage vaccinations. But public perception is going to be, considerably influenced by, how badly the situation goes and who are in fact, managing or handling this for better or for worse. Right? And we know the saying. I mean, at least in English, cometh the hour, cometh the man. And we are beginning to see that, although the hour has come, and it is a pretty serious, late hour with a lot of big problems, we haven't seen the kinds of leadership that probably a lot simply surrender, I think, to authoritarian leadership, because the last 20 years, if they proved anything, they proved that there is a very large reservoir of anti-authoritarian sentiment, which today cannot be publicly expressed, partly because of the pandemic and the lockdowns, and partly because of the associated state of emergency. But that is this sense of trying to get a leadership that people can trust, leaders who are not like Bridget's Three Stooges, and we know that crisis is a time when either leaders show their ability or they show their inability, and there's very little, I think, to choose between the two. If you ask a lot of people, right? Either you have good people who come up in a matter, during a crisis, or you don't. But again, it seems to me it depends on how this crisis will turn, whether we will get some satisfactory solutions quickly. If I could just back up a bit, I think that maybe for the present regime, towards about a year ago, when they opened up, lifted the lockdowns and allowed people to move freely, that was the time when the regime felt that it was in control. And a lot of people, if I remember correctly, because actually I had just come home then, a lot of people seem to have confidence, in the regime. They had confidence in the Ministry of Health. And but today, if you listen again to friends, to relatives, to people on
Boo Teik, we can't hear you. Your mic's off.
Sorry, have you not been able to hear me all along?
No, just recently.
Okay, yeah, now only
Can
I
I
saw
make
just somehow went there. Sorry.
Sorry, Boo Teik, I'm just going to make a quick announcement. For anybody who enters late, can you just turn your video off because it's very disruptive, and the speaker is speaking. Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Boo Teik.
Yeah, I think I've already said quite a few things. Let me just come to one last point. Again, it's a fairly general sort of point. Bridget referred, interestingly, to new forms of social mobilization or community mobilization. But except that the forms may be different, don't forget that these trends and these initiatives in mobilization have gone on since 1998, almost non-stop, except for maybe immediately after GE14, when I think a lot of the activists probably felt that they needed and deserved a rest. And so we are picking up from there, except some issues have changed. Some issues may not have changed. What I would like to say actually more generally is this: in emphasizing that we are having a lot of new things happening, don't forget that these kinds of initiatives, etc., and the politics, they are never played out, they are never conducted in a kind of a historical vacuum. We have lots of things that we inherit from the past, and for better or for worse, it is probably today easier for even younger people to mobilize, to make alliances, to form networks, partly because they are building on a lot of work that had been done with inferior tools, although at the time they look like really great tools, right? I mean, those days people used to talk about the information superhighway. We haven't seen anything like what we have now. And because of that, I think there are many possibilities for them to connect. In some other analysis that I've done before, I had said that one of the interesting things, that took place after Reformasi, let's say up to about around the time of the first electoral tsunami, 2008, was the creation of, cyber communities. So let's say, imagine cyber communities of dissent. And those were days when people could still express themselves publicly, Bersih, Hindraf, and so on and so on. Today, they can't. But the ability to work across networks and for older organizations to work with newer organizations, I think that one of the good things is that they at least have a historical basis. Right? It is not likely, no matter how much I'm encouraged, and no matter how much one may be inspired by the work of the young at every point, it is not likely that we can make that much of progress unless the younger and the older, but not the really, really old ones, right, can find ways to enrich their ideas and to be able to learn from one another's experiences, hopes, mistakes and missteps and so on. So, perhaps I should just end there and let people, carry on the discussion, principally with Bridget. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Boo Teik. Do we have, so Bridget, welcome back. Would you like to speak to some of what Boo Teik has said about, how there's a continuity in terms of young people, especially activists? What has really changed and what hasn't really changed? Is there the sort of, the advice for intergenerational bridging, I suppose, is a good one, but I can also see younger activists saying that they haven't learned very much from perhaps some of the people coming up from the Reformasi generation. I think maybe it's also a reaction against some of those people who have come up from the Reformasi generation as well, that this new set of activists have come about. What are your thoughts?
So there are a couple of things I would like to speak to, and as always, Boo Teik, it's really wonderful to hear from you. I would say, first of all, I do believe that things are going to get worse before they get better. But there are also things that are happening that are positive as things are getting worse. That's what I'm trying to suggest. But, I feel that the crisis is still, in terms of the immediate health crisis, very serious, but the economic crisis and the societal crisis will come after. And Malaysia's position within the region and the impact of how it's managed COVID compared to other places will be, I think, more challenging for Malaysia to deal with because it's a different international environment. So yes, I agree that that things are still going to be very rough. The second point, in terms of dealing with the issues of continuity, I think there is a continuity from the perspective of the pervasiveness of the focus on a reform narrative. As Boo Teik, as you've pointed out, since 1999, the focus is about making the system better. But what is interesting is that the last few years have really broken a lot of trust of people in those who were trying to say they were trying to fix it, and B, the way that they're going about it. And this is, in a sense, it's not clear where things will move, but I do feel that we are seeing some break with the kind of the way Reformasi has been practiced, in the sense that it's not the elite dominant narratives of saying we're going to fix the system for you. People don't trust anymore. And this is true even for Pakatan Harapan, as it is for people who are trying to use reform as a way to legitimize their tenure. And what's interesting is that this current government has it's basically not used reform at all, because it doesn't. It started to for a few moments to say it, but in its substance, it hasn't been. And so I think that there are more fissures that I think are interesting to observe in terms of the way this narrative is being owned in different ways, and also how it's how you're dealing with a different environment where you have much less trust in the system itself across the different particular sets of actors. And this is part and parcel of the kind of the transformation that is taking place. But I think at the same time, I take your point is very well taken, and I think the young activists that we see emerging, they're very diverse. So I think that they haven't coalesced in choosing. And I think it's still too early to see how they're going to evolve from a perspective of the different sets of actors. We can see snippets of the old patterns, and also kind of a lot of very different types of discussions and a way of organizing. But I'd like to open it up to others to think about. But I thought your comments were very valuable, and they're making me think more, and I'll try to reflect on them and get back to you as I reflect further.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Boo Teik. So let's open the floor up for questions. People can type in the chat box, or if you look at the top button, there's a little man with a hand up, and you can put your hand up, and we'll call on you to ask your question. Okay, Stephen Nachuk has a question. Do you want to go ahead and unmute your mic, Stephen?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I believe me, I use Teams all the time. I'm Stefan Nachek. I'm with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I'm in KL now. One thing that I just wanted to kind of highlight and kind of ask a little bit more about is, we didn't talk much about data, but if you look at, for example, GDP per capita in Malaysia in 2000 versus today, and look at the regional comparators against, say, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, the Philippines, the larger middle-income Asian countries, in every single case, Malaysia's relative position has declined, right? From, it was 5 times as much in Indonesia in 2000, it's about 2.5 times now. It was double Thailand, now it's about 50% more. So, and none of these countries are paragons of excellent governance either, okay? So there's something interesting going on here that's not just today, right? And I would love for the speakers to speak a little bit more. It's more of a frog boiling in water almost issue, right? Things are still okay in some respects, but there's something going on that I think is intriguing, and I'd love any thoughts on that.
Bridget?
Yeah, so I think, you're quite right. Malaysia's comparative position is weakening across the board. And my concern is that its management of COVID will escalate that even further. I think we see this in terms of its lockdown dependence and the impact on the international supply chains and the response from the international communities. I mean, manufacturing sector, which has been relatively isolated to some of the more problematic aspects of governance, have now been, having to readjust to a different environment where they have to deal with more holistically with some of the poorer governance aspects of corruption and not necessarily consistent processing and accountability, that of which I think are underscoring some of the dimensions. But if we look at the kind of the 3 issues that are problematic from the perspective of Malaysia, I think number 1 is that you have such significant leakages in the system from the perspective of the fact that it's not just about the amount of corruption, but it is about the kind of systemized practices that don't allow for different enough more openness and competitiveness and emergence of different type of economic activity that really kind of help reduce Malaysia's competitiveness. The second, of course, issue is the pervasiveness of issues of race and religion, which, if we compare to the regional neighbors, is one of the most serious problems that puts Malaysia at a comparative disadvantage. And the trajectory has been to deepen some of those issues as opposed to reduce and move away from these issues. And this, of course, reflects the weaknesses of the leadership and the reliance on identity politics. And this is something that if they continue to rely on this in a kind of more global environment where the other things that are very positive about Malaysia, this actually helps to negatively affect the country's competitiveness. I think the third factor, however, is that the policy discussions, which I think have increased and are becoming more fundamental, the meaningful aspects of reform have been very uneven. And I think that in comparison to a place like Vietnam or Indonesia, while there are the same problems of corruption and others that are there and authoritarian aspects of leadership, there hasn't been the same willingness to kind of take deep policy reforms that are structural in dealing with the economy, dealing with foreign workers, for example, dealing with issues of wages, and there hasn't been a thinking about it because the thinking is very much short-term or on survivalist type of politics, which or kind of relying on old practices of kind of using patronage type of politics, where other countries have had their crises and they have had to make some sets of adjustments. And Malaysia is, in a sense, lags behind because of that, and at least from a kind of broader macro perspective.
We've got 3 questions in the box. Maybe I'll just quickly read them out so you can kind of figure out how much time you want to allocate to them. The first question is, will the country descend into a failed state because of questions around corruption, institutional integrity, etc.? The second question is that both PN and PH are dead fish in the water, especially in terms of policy alternatives. Why are we not seeing the rise of ideologically alternative political parties offering a more progressive view of politics as we move forward? The third question is about the prosecution of Syed Siddiq. Do you think that will galvanize the youth movement in the next GE? Then, yeah, Mike. There are more questions coming up too.
All right, I'll do 3 and then I'll stop.
Okay,
in that circumstance.
Yeah. Your mic's off again.
Sorry about this. Let me speak to Nazrin's question about the issues of youth politics. On one side, right, we can see this kind of parallels to 1998 and the arrest of a politician or the charging of a politician, and I think there's some of that in the lens. But I think that it does alienate a large section of support, and we can see that how well he's been able to raise money in a short period of time speaks to the kind of the sense that this was not the wise thing to do. And of course, he's been able to control the narrative on these issues to date. But I think that the underlying issues that are going to drive youth politics are not about this individual, but more about the problems of of access to education, job security, low wages, high cost of living, high unemployment, which, if from the perspective of Malaysia historically, we're in an era where this is among the highest. And the same issues associated with high cost of housing, issues associated with cost of living, have been really pivotal drivers in youth politics in the last 3 elections. Right, and we could see these patterns. And in 2013, Najib's government was more effective in being able to co-opt some of the youth areas with a lot of distribution and patronage at that point of time. But the youth mobilization and youth challenges that are more fundamental because there's less social mobility, higher costs, have really been happening for the last decade, and these are likely to be the most important drivers, I think, at this particular juncture of understanding how the youth moves. And so, when studies of youth point out that, for example, when we look at the ideological spectrum, we see that a lot of young people are conservative, and many Malaysian youth compared to other parts of the region are more conservative than some of the other countries. But we also have to look and recognize what is the main issue that drives young people, and that is their bread and butter issues. Bread and butter issues are predominant in that, but those narratives can be transferred in different sets of ways depending on the issues of the leadership. So, what is interesting to see now is how MUDA will evolve. I think that what we have seen is that it wants to have a multiracial kind of fabric, but it doesn't yet have a clear platform. And in some ways, I think that the charging of Saitsidik gives MUDA a kind of opening, even bigger opening than it had before, on an environment, on a group of constituents that I think are actually very powerful. But their program cannot be just youth driven to be successful. They'll have to actually have a bigger type of program, and that is not what we've seen yet in that context. But I do see that they have a comparative advantage because none of the other parties, and I mean none, okay, are actually having any effective youth programs and engagement. And in fact, they're actually disengaging because they don't have party renewal, which I was speaking about earlier. Where are the younger leaders emerging in UMNO? Where are the younger leaders emerging in the DAP? They think of the young leaders, but these leaders are no longer young in this context. So we see these comparative kind of points. And some of the parties that have chosen to not to first support under 18 and now not support under 18 have really hurt themselves. And I think the party that is most interesting to watch youth, from my perspective, is PAS, because PAS has won a lot of support in a lot of elections among younger voters, especially in key areas such as in Terengganu and Kelantan, for example, which has been very pivotal for their maintaining control of these states. But we're going to see how that affects them now, because they also have the same kind of bottleneck in terms of leadership transition that other parties are having. So this is just some observation, Nazrin, to your very rich discussion, which I'm sure we could continue more on. Now, let me go to the first question, which had to do with, I'm now looking here, I forgot what, I didn't write them down. Okay, so the issue of pH and PN and pH, dead fish in the water in terms of policy alternatives. Why are not seeing ideological alternative political parties offering more progressive vision? I think one of the points I'm trying to raise is that we are seeing some of those issues happening in public now. We do see a lot more discussion of progressive issues about poverty, about social safety nets, about wages, about labor rights, about the rights of undocumented persons. These, while the government is taking very strong positions, the narratives in public are shifting. And I do see the emergence to a more left politics in terms of political narratives compared to the past, and compared to the history of the past of Malaysia, where the left narrative is quite robust from the perspective of kind of the range of policy discussions that are focused particularly on social safety net issues and broadening the kind of the security of ordinary people. But they are what will be interesting is to see whether or not PH and elements within PH are able to try to bring in some of those progressive narratives. And one of the things that we see is in all of these parties, we see this transition, this debate between the left and the right, right? And so most times people use, when they conceptualize the left, they look at, populist type of initiatives and increasing the kind of patronage or the cash transfer programs and others. There hasn't been more robust in those assessments. But I think that because there are the ideological divisions within the parties, we're going to see more discussions and more pressure points. And we can see those divisions really quite sharply in UMNO, and we can see that sharply within DAP as examples, and even some within PKR. And I think we're going to see those things evolve further. So what I'm saying is that, well, it would appear that both PN and PH are dead. I would say PN is dead fish, but I would say more UMNO and BN elements and PH are dead. I don't seem to have policy alternatives. I think that there will be elements within that to try to have discussions of that. But of course, the problem is that this is conditional on whether or not they allow new leaders to emerge, because under the current sets of leaders, they're not likely to have any of these policy discussions. All right, so what was the first question, Gek? I seem to have, was this the Chua's question about the issues of NEP?
Yeah, it probably started with the NEP.
Oh, failed state, yes, okay.
Yeah. So
I've come out publicly to say that I think that that a failed state is a very different type of concept than what we can see. And if we talk about the concept of where we're talking about a failed state, if we want to look at Southeast Asia, we don't have to look too far to see the situation in Myanmar. A major conflict, complete institutional breakdown, and others. But I think that there are clearly failings, right? But keep in mind, for many people, there's a forgiveness of those failings, especially in the heartland or among core supporters. They're refusing to see that. There's still a lot of denial, even in the system. But I think that one has to disaggregate between a failing government and then a failed state, for me, conceptually. And these issues are, it is likely to continue to do so. But as you rightly point out, Cage, that is, we see a situation where the fundamental structural problems that are being exposed underscore some of the main reasons why one of the main reasons that the government is failing. You have a weak education system, you have no checks on institutional integrity, you have policies that continue to reduce Malaysia's competitiveness in a meaningful way, and no alternative policies that address the need to address some of the social inequalities that exist. So how is this balanced, right? These institutional failures with a failing government. And it's not necessarily it is not a failed state, but it is one that that an alternative government has to embrace the issues of reform. And ironically, one of the things that's happening now is that the failure of the previous government, Pakatan Harapan, to really engage in meaningful reform, which would have involved a lot more time than they were in power anyway, right? But a lot more prioritization of that has opened up the circumstances for an alternative government to begin to think about what those reforms are. What is interesting is that during this crisis, Pakatan Harapan is not talking about what those reforms are or should be. They're just talking about change or issues. So, do I see things getting worse? Yes. Do I see the structural dimensions contributing to failing government? Yes. Do I see Malaysia moving down into something that is equated globally with what a failed state is? No. But I think that Malaysia is at a point where interventions can make a huge difference. While I do think that there are dynamics of that are very serious for the country to challenge, to address, there is the capacity here to address it. And this is what I think people don't want to acknowledge or don't appreciate, is that Malaysia has all the talent that it can. It's just not necessarily always in the political leadership. And so how to bring those in and co-opt that is really kind of one of the more interesting dimensions of what is happening. Sorry, I'm giving long answers, Gek. I think there are more questions.
No, don't worry. There's one question from Eliza Rahim. What are your thoughts about Monday's Parliament
Jack,
session?
I have to go out and come back in because of my hearing problem here on the system. I'll be right back.
Okay. Okay, so we've got 3 minutes left, and hopefully if you can stay, we can go on for a little bit more. Bridget?
Yeah.
Okay, so what are your thoughts about Monday's Parliament session? Is there potential for a directional change in handling of the crisis?
I've come out in my writing about the need for a parliament, for need for more inclusion, more robust discussion of policy issues. I worry that Monday is not a real parliamentary session where the debate, it's basically been a series of briefings so people can ask sets of questions. That's not a parliament session. I also think that it's interesting to see what kind of alternatives are being raised and what issues are going to be substantively discussed. I am concerned that the opposition is not focused on putting out alternatives, and I think even some of the conversations that we've seen so far are really kind of add-ons as opposed to talking about the kind of more fundamental challenges that are there. And part of that is because I think that there's still too much politicking happening. But I do see the opening of Parliament in whatever form that it has as a positive step, and I hope that it's a more robust discussion because Malaysia needs conversations about its crisis, about the crisis it's facing, and it needs more accountability about what is happening and questions being raised about what is happening in order to kind of make it more holistically being able to move forward in a meaningful way. And I think that Parliament offers the opportunity to have some of that. But we all have to recognize that in this context that Malaysia, these problems are not going to be solved through a 5-day session of Parliament. It's just a small, very small step in a series of things that are needed.
So the last question isn't really a question from Stefan. I think it's more of a comment. He said that you mentioned the challenges of structural reform. Interestingly, in the health sector, not COVID, Malaysia is also an outlier in the region in terms of not being able to undertake a large structural health reform. Creation of a national health insurance agency, for example, which has happened in other parts of Southeast Asia. So Malaysia still has a credible system in many respects, but the reform challenges are apparent. So do we have any last questions? We're coming to 4:30. Or does Boo Teik have any thing to add? Boo Teik?
Thank you, but I don't really have anything to add. I mean, I think that's a lot already, and the questions, have been tackled quite well by Bridget. So, and since we don't have very much more time, there's no more point in trying to just add what words there may be. Thank you, though.
Okay. Well, I'd like to. So since it's 4:30 already, I'd like to thank you all for coming. And to thank the speaker and the discussant, Bridget and Boo Teik, for a really interesting, enlightening talk. And things are still, it's not that hopeful. Things are, as both speakers have said, it's going to get worse before it gets better. But let's hope that you can actively participate in strengthening democracy in this country by supporting young activists if they go out there, or your community groups. And with that, I'd like to wrap up. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Bridget, and thank you, Boo Teik. And maybe we could even have a kind of open unmute and have a round of applause.
Well, that's not necessary, but I would like to say that. Thank you, it's very kind. But I want to say, still have hope, right? And that not just in the young people. I have hope in Malaysia, and I believe in Malaysia, and I think that, and I think that there's a lot of good things happening, even in difficulty.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for your kindness for
Bye-bye.
coming on a Saturday. Thanks.